Plateau number 9, 1933, Micropolitics and Segmentarity. We are segmented from all around and in every direction. The human being is a segmentary animal. Segmentarity is inherent to all the strata composing us. Dwelling, getting around, working, playing, life is spatially and socially segmented. The house is segmented according to its rooms' assigned purposes. Streets according to the order of the city. The factory according to the nature of the work and operations performed in it. We are segmented in a binary fashion, following the great major dualist oppositions. Social classes, but also men, women, adults, children, and so on. We are segmented in a circular fashion, in ever larger circles, ever wider discs or coronas, like Joyce's letter, my affairs, my neighborhood's affairs, my cities, my countries, the world's. We are segmented in a linear fashion, along a straight line or a number of straight lines, of which each segment represents an episode or proceeding. As soon as we finish one proceeding, we begin another, forever proceduring or procedured in the family, in school, in the army, on the job. School tells us you're not at home anymore. The army tells us you're not in school anymore. Sometimes the various segments belong to different individuals or groups, and sometimes the same individual or group passes from one segment to another. But these figures of segmentarity, the binary, circular, and linear, are bound up with one another, even cross over into each other, changing according to the point of view. This is already evident among so-called savage peoples. Lizo shows how the communal house is organized in circular fashion, going from interior to exterior in a series of coronas within which certain types of localizable activities take place. Worship and ceremonies, followed by exchange of goods, followed by family life, followed by trash and excrement. At the same time, quote, each of these coronas is itself transversally divided. Each segment devolves upon a particular lineage and is subdivided among different kinship groups. End quote. In a more general context, Lévi-Strauss shows that the dualist organization of primitive peoples has a circular form and also takes a linear form, encompassing, quote, any number of groups, end quote, at least 3. Why return to the primitives when it is a question of our own life? The fact is that the notion of segmentarity was constructed by ethnologists to account for so-called primitive societies which have no fixed central state apparatus and no global power mechanisms or specialized political institutions. In these societies, the social segments have a certain leeway between the two extreme poles of fusion and scission, depending on the task and the situation. There is also considerable communicability between heterogeneous elements, so that one segment can fit with another in a number of different ways, and they have a local construction excluding the prior determination of a base domain, economic, political, juridical, artistic. They have extrinsic and situational properties, or relations irreducible to the intrinsic properties of a structure. Activity is continuous, so segmentarity is not grasped as something separate from a segmentation in progress operating by outgrowths, detachments, and mergings. Primitive segmentarity is characterized by a polyvocal code based on lineages and their varying situations and relations, and an itinerant territoriality based on local overlapping divisions. Codes and territories, clan lineages and tribal territorialities form a fabric of relatively supple segmentarity. However, it seems to us difficult to maintain that state societies, even our modern states, are any less segmentary. The classical opposition between segmentarity and centralization hardly seems relevant. Not only does the state exercise power over the segments it sustains or permits to survive, but it possesses and imposes its own segmentarity. Perhaps the opposition sociologists establish between the segmentary and the central is biological, deep down, the ringed worm and the central nervous system. But the central brain itself is a worm even more segmented than the others, in spite of and including all of its vicarious actions. There is no opposition between the central and the segmentary. The modern political system is a global whole, unified and unifying, but is so because it implies a constellation of juxtaposed, imbricated, ordered subsystems. The analysis of decision-making brings to light all kinds of compartmentalizations and partial processes that interconnect, but not without gaps and displacements. Technocracy operates by the segmentary division of labor. This applies to the international division of labor as well. Bureaucracy exists only in compartmentalized offices and functions only by goal displacements and the corresponding dysfunctions. Hierarchy is not simply pyramidal. The boss's office is as much at the end of the hall as on top of the tower. In short, we would say that modern life has not done away with segmentarity, but has, on the contrary, made it exceptionally rigid. Instead of setting up an opposition between the segmentary and the centralized, we should make a distinction between two types of segmentarity, one primitive and supple, the other modern and rigid. This distinction reframes each of the figures previously discussed. 1. Binary oppositions, men-women, those on top versus those on the bottom, etc., are very strong in primitive societies but seem to be the result of machines and assemblages that are not in themselves binary. The social binarity between men and women in a group applies rules according to which both sexes must take their respective spouses from different groups, which is why there are at least 3 groups. Thus, Levi-Strauss can demonstrate that dualist organization never stands on its own in this kind of society. On the contrary, it is a particularity of modern societies, or rather state societies, to bring into their own duality machines that function as such and proceed simultaneously by biunivocal relationships and successively by binarized choices. Classes and sexes come in twos, and phenomena of tripartition result from a transposition of the dual, not the reverse. We have already encountered this, notably in the case of the face machine, which differs in this respect from primitive head machines. It seems that modern societies elevated dual segmentarity to the level of a self-sufficient organization. The question, therefore, is not whether the status of women or those on the bottom is better or worse, but the type of organization from which that status results. 2. Similarly, we may note that in primitive societies, circular segmentarity does not necessarily imply that the circles are concentric or have the same center. In a supple regime, centers already act as so many knots, eyes, or black holes, but they do not all resonate together. They do not fall on the same point. They do not converge in the same black hole. There is a multiplicity of animist eyes, each of which is assigned, for example, a particular animal spirit, snake spirit, woodpecker spirit, caiman spirit. Each black hole is occupied by a different animal eye. Doubtless, we see operations of rigidification and centralization take shape here and there. All of the centers must collect on a single circle, which itself has a single center. The shaman draws lines between all the points or spirits, outlines a constellation, a radiating set of roots tied to a central tree. This is the birth of a centralized power with an arborescent system to discipline the outgrowths of the primitive rhizome. Here, the tree simultaneously plays the role of a principle of dichotomy or binarity and an axis of rotation. But the power of the shaman is still entirely localized, strictly dependent upon a particular segment, contingent upon drugs, and each point continues to emit independent sequences. The same cannot be said of modern societies or even of states. Of course, the centralized is not opposed to the segmentary and the circles remain distinct, but they become concentric, definitively arborified. The segmentarity becomes rigid to the extent that all centers resonate in and all black holes fall on a single point of accumulation that is like a point of intersection somewhere behind the eyes. The face of the teacher, father, colonel, boss enter into redundancy, refer back to a center of significance that moves across the various circles and passes back over all the segments. The supple micro-heads with animal facializations are replaced by a macro-face, whose center is everywhere and circumference nowhere. There are no longer N eyes in the sky or in becomings animal and vegetable, but a central computing eye scanning all of the radii. The central state is constituted not by the abolition of circular segmentarity, but by a concentricity of distinct circles, or the organization of a resonance among centers. There are already just as many power centers in primitive societies, or, if one prefers, there are still just as many in state societies. The latter, however, behave as apparatuses of resonance. They organize resonance, whereas the former inhibit it. 3. Finally, in the case of linear segmentarity, we would say that each segment is underscored, rectified, and homogenized in its own right, but also in relation to the others. Not only does each have its own unit of measure, but there is an equivalence and translatability between units. The central eye has, as its correlate, a space through which it moves, but it itself remains invariant in relation to its movements. With the Greek city-state and Cleisthenes' reform, a homogeneous and isotropic space appears that overcodes the lineal segments at the same time as distinct focal points begin to resonate in a center acting as their common denominator. Paul Virilio shows that after the Greek city-state, the Roman Empire imposes a geometrical or linear reason of state, including a general outline of camps and fortifications, a universal art of marking boundaries by lines, a laying out of territories, a substitution of space for places and territorialities, and a transformation of the world into the city, in short, an increasingly rigid segmentarity. The segments, once underscored or overcoded, seem to lose their ability to bud. They seem to lose their dynamic relation to segmentations in progress, or in the act of coming together or coming apart. If there exists a primitive geometry, a proto-geometry, it is an operative geometry in which figures are never separable from the affectations befalling them, the lines of their becoming, the segments of their segmentation. There is a roundness, but no circle, alignments but no straight line, etc. On the contrary, state geometry, or rather the bond between the state and geometry, manifests itself in the primacy of the theorem element, which substitutes fixed or ideal essences for supple morphological formations, properties for affects, predetermined segments for segmentations in progress. Geometry and arithmetic take on the power of the scalpel. Private property implies a space that has been overcoded and gridded by surveying. Not only does each line have its segments, but the segments of one line correspond to those of another. For example, the wage regime establishes a correspondence between monetary segments, production segments, and consumable goods segments. We may summarize the principal differences between rigid segmentarity and supple segmentarity. In the rigid mode, binary segmentarity stands on its own and is governed by great machines of direct binarization, whereas in the other mode, binarities result from multiplicities of n dimensions. Second, circular segmentarity tends to become concentric, in other words, causes all of its focal points to coincide in a single center that is in constant movement but remains invariant through its movements and is part of a machine of resonance. Finally, linear segmentarity feeds into a machine of overcoding that constitutes more geometrico homogeneous space and extracts segments that are determinate as to their substance, form, and relations. It will be noted that this rigid segmentarity is always expressed by the tree. The tree is the knot of arborescence or principle of dichotomy. It is the axis of rotation guaranteeing concentricity. It is the structure or network gridding the possible. This opposition between arborified and rhizomatic segmentarity is not just meant to indicate two states of a single process, but also to isolate two different processes. For primitive societies operate essentially by codes and territorialities. It is in fact the distinction between these two elements, the tribal system of territories and the clan system of lineages, that prevents resonance. Modern or state societies, on the other hand, have replaced the declining codes with a univocal overcoding and the lost territories with a specific reterritorialization, which takes place in an overcoded geometrical space. Segmentarity is always the result of an abstract machine, but different abstract machines operate in the rigid and the supple.